Welcome back, students. This is the second session of the Book of the Covenant with Rabbi David Silber. Thank you for joining us and Rabbi Silber as he continues his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. This term will provide an analysis of the laws of Exodus 21-23 that are central to the Covenant of Sinai. Sources for today's class will be shared on screen from Sefaria, but you are always welcome to follow along in your own preferred copy of Tanakh or Chumash. And with that, I am happy to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, so today we're going to continue. We started with the Mishpatim, which is in chapter 21 of Sefer Shemot, and it begins very importantly at the first set of laws, and actually the longest treatment are the laws of the slave. Last week we read the laws of the Eved Ivri, which is understood as a Jewish man who's a slave. That's chapter 21, the beginning of chapter 21. And a few verses later, in pasuk number 7 of chapter 21, the Torah takes up the question of what about a woman? What about a woman? The status of the female slave, Jewish slave. We're talking here of a Jewish slave. Now, as I mentioned last week, it's not that surprising that the treatment or the laws that are found in this collection of laws, of which in the Torah there are several. But this particular collection of laws that it would start with slavery is not really that surprising given the larger narrative context of these laws. These laws are situated in the book of Shemot, or as we call it, the book of Exodus. The main theme of the book, and certainly the central theme of the first half of the book, without question, is Yetziat Mitzrayim. We were slaves in Egypt, and God freed us from Egypt. As it says in the Ten Commandments, Ani Hashem Elokecha asher hoteti otcha, right? Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hoteti otcha mi'eretz Mitzrayim. I'm the God who took you out of Egypt. That's how God presents God in the Ten Commandments. So it's not very surprising. What is extremely interesting is that this the laws relating to the Hebrew slave are actually found in three places in the Torah. One is here in the book of Shemot. The second is found some length in the book of Vayikra. We'll see that in chapter 25 of Vayikra. That's the chapter that begins with the laws of the sabbatical year of the Shemitah and the Jubilee year. And in that chapter, which is a long set of laws, there's a lengthy discussion of the laws of the Hebrew slave. And then in the book of Devarim, we also have a discussion, a treatment of laws relating to the slave, to the Hebrew slave, to the male slave, to the female slave, the Jewish slave. As I mentioned last week, the Torah, at least here, did not rid it. The Torah does not rid the people of slavery. In other words, the idea of slavery still exists over here. The Torah puts limits on it. We saw that last week and we'll continue to see it. But what is very striking when it comes to laws of slavery that appear in three different books of the Torah is that they are quite different from each other. The most striking will be the laws of slavery found in the book of Vayikra, and we will turn our attention to that soon. And of course, Sefer Devarim, not surprisingly, because Sefer Devarim, whenever it references laws that we have encountered earlier, typically they're not exactly the same. So we expect some difference, but Sefer Vayikra will have a radical difference between what we read here in Shemot, and we'll continue with that now, and what we're going to see in the book of Vayikra, and then we'll also reference the book of Devarim and see how these three texts work together. The rabbinic project, I would say, in the creation of a complete set of laws, one of the things that the Talmud does all the time is to take these different passages and from the different passages try to relate them one to the other. It tries somehow to work out what would appear to be quite different rules, I would say even contradictory rules. When it comes to the Hebrew slave, they are very contradictory. Our focus will be on what it says in the Torah, as best we can understand it. Pshuto shel Mikra, how the rabbinic system developed, how the Talmud and the codes which follow work this out into some kinds of integrated set of laws and to arrive at a system of law. That's not the topic of these sessions. It's a very interesting question, but I think when we will take a look at it carefully, we'll be very struck by the differences between these three different places in our Torah, which deal with the laws of the Eved Ivri and the Amma Ivri, the male and the female slave. Let's first take a look now, as we continue our study in chapter 21 of Shemot. Let's begin with verse number 7. First 6 verses we saw last week. We'll reference them again, of course. But here the Torah continues with the laws of the slave. In this case, in verse number 7, it says the following: V'chiyim kar ish et bitoli amma, lo teitzei ketzei ta'avadim. If a man sell his daughter as an amma, here they translate as a slave. Amma is a slave. There may be a difference, and there probably is a difference between the word shifcha and the word amma. We encounter that, for example, in the story of Sarah. When Sarah, unable to have her own children, after 10 years of living in the land, says to Abraham, take my amma, whose name is Hagar, in chapter 16, and take my shifcha. Sarah had a shifcha named Hagar, and she says to her husband Abraham, take this woman as an amma, and if she has a child, I will be built up through her, some kind of surrogate motherhood. But there the Torah seems to distinguish between a shifcha and then amma. Sometimes in the Torah, the same woman is called both a shifcha and an amma. Apart from Hagar, Jacob's two other wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, sometimes they're called amma, sometimes they're called wives, nashav, and sometimes shifchotav. So depending on the context, etc. And these shifcha and amma are to some extent interchangeable, but they would appear to suggest something very different. In any event, here the Torah begins with, if a man sells his daughter as an amma, let's call it a slave. First of all, a man apparently can sell his daughter as a slave. As I mentioned, the Torah did not eliminate slavery. Here he actually sells her as a slave. The Torah says, Lo teitzei ketzei ta'avadim. She doesn't leave slavery as the male slaves would. She has a different set of rules. Lo teitzei ketzei ta'avadim. And the Torah continues. Im ra'a b'yenei adoneha asher lo ya'ada v'hefta li'amna chri lo yimshol l'machra v'vigdova. A difficult verse. So the translation we have before us, this translation, if she proves to be displeasing to her master, ra'a b'yenei adoneha asher lo ya'ada v'hefta. And what does lo ya'ada v'hefta mean? So we have two words. We have the word ya'ada, and we have the word hefta, right? In other words, ya'ada, yi'ud, means to be designated. So apparently what the Torah seems to be saying is that if you bought this girl, and I say girl because she's probably very young. In fact, the Talmud assumes that she has not reached maturity yet. Father is permitted to sell her. If you bought her as a slave, however, the Torah says she the one who is designated for you. If he has neither taken her as a designated one or the hefdah, which is very unclear, which may mean or he has redeemed her. In other words, the point, we'll get back to that in a second. Ya'ada v'hefdah could be understood as two different things. If he didn't do it, he's not permitted to sell her to someone else, to a foreigner, since he has betrayed her or broke faith with her. I'll explain in a second. If he designated her for his son, then he, the son, must treat her as he would treat any girl, or we would say any woman, which means if he, or presumably his son, took another wife, he cannot withhold from her she'er, ksut, and ona. Now, what she'er, ksut, and ona are is a great dispute between Rashi and the Ramban and others. But these she'er, ksut, and ona are typically the obligations that a man has towards his wife. Conjugal rights. She'er, according to Rashi, means food. Ksut is her clothing. In other words, this woman that he purchased as an amah, the Torah seems to be saying the obligation of the man who bought her as an amah is to convert her into his wife. Now, it doesn't have to be his wife. He can buy her and he can hand her off to his son, in which case the son is then married to this woman. And the Torah makes the point that his obligations to this woman who was purchased as an amah is identical, presumably, to obligations that one has towards one's wife. In other words, what the Torah is saying over here is that fundamentally, what he should do is he should marry her. When you buy a female Jewish slave, you purchase her for the purpose of marriage, either for yourself or for your son. Now, what the word vehefda means is unclear. So I'll get to that in a minute. But in other words, apparently, there are three things. If you buy a female slave, then there are three options. You can buy the female slave, and you can have yi'ud for yourself. You can have yi'ud for your son, or possibly the third is vehefda. I'll come back to that in a second. That's what you're supposed to do. And the Torah says, V'im shlosh ego lo ya'aseh in verse number 11. If he didn't do one of these three things, right? The three things are presumably Ya'adah for himself, Ya'adah for his son, and Hefta. If he doesn't want to do those three, V'yatzah chinam ein kesef, then she goes out for nothing. So in other words, what the Torah seems to be saying here is very simply that when it comes to slavery, when it comes to the male slave, there is slavery, but the male slave goes out after 6 years of slavery. If the male slave wishes to stay on, and the male slave, if he's married when he becomes a slave, he remains married. After 6 years, he leaves with his family. On the other hand, if he comes not married, or if the master maybe gives him an additional a wife, a shifta, a slave, he can give the slave to the Jewish slave as a kind of wife, and when children are born, they stay after 6 years. They stay with the master. That's the story when it comes to the male slave. When it comes to the female slave, and one other thing, and according to this, the Torah says if the slave wants to stay on, he doesn't want to leave. He's happy with it. He likes his wife, and he likes his children. And if he leaves, the wife that was given to him by the master, she stays with the master, and he has to leave. If they have children, they stay with the master. So he may not want that. He doesn't want that. So he has the option to say, I don't want to leave the master because I love my family. I even love my master. I'm happy. I don't want to leave. Then he's allowed to stay. His ear is pierced, and he remains a slave forever. That's when it comes to the man. When it comes to the woman, the Torah says they have a completely different set of laws. She doesn't go out like a normal slave would go out. In other words, female slavery becomes converted into marriage. The issue is, what does vehefda mean? So the way the Talmud seems to understand vehefda is that there's another way that the girl can leave slavery, and that is if somebody redeems her. In other words, what is redeems her would mean somebody sort of buys her back because it's a purchase. Let's say he bought it for $1,000. So then, the way the Talmud understands it, someone else can say, I don't want it to be a slave anymore. She yeah, take. I'll give you with $500 or whatever the amount is. I don't know how it would be computed according to the Talmud. Well, according to the Talmud, it's 6 years. Talmud assumes it's 6 years for the girl as well. So then, if she's been with him for 3 years, if you give $500, then she would go out free. That's the Talmudic understanding of the hefta. But in any event, there are 3 different options over here. But if none of the options play out, then the Torah says v'yotza chidam, that she simply leaves. In other words, when we read the text, though, the plain text over here, without the rabbinic understandings of it, what it seems like is that the 6 years is only for the man, because the Torah says nothing about 6 years for the woman. It doesn't say 6 years for the woman because he's supposed to marry her. So you wouldn't have to wait for 6 years. She's not really a slave in that sense. She's a wife. Of course, the definition of wife in the Torah is not clear, but one thing is clear, and that is the Torah says the husband has obligations to his wife, and that remains the same obligation no matter how many wives he has. If he took another one, if he took an additional wife, Sherak Sutavi Onota Lo Yigra, he can't withhold from her what is her due, the obligations that a man has towards his wife. That's a whole other conversation, what exactly these obligations are, and a very interesting dispute of Rashi and the Rambam, but that's not our topic right now. But so what we have over here is, in the book of Exodus, there is slavery, but the Torah seems to limit it in 2 ways. For the man, it limits it in terms of time. It gives him the option to stay on beyond 6 years. And for the woman, this girl whose father sold her as a slave, there it appears that the Torah wants to eliminate what we would call slavery altogether and convert it into marriage. She's going to stay with him. She's got to be his wife. She can't just stay with him as a slave. That's what the Torah appears to be saying in chapter 21 in Parshat Mishpatim, in the beginning of this whole section of the Book of the Covenant. So that's just a continuation of what we saw last week. And before we continue to a set of what I think are remarkable verses of the Torah, if anybody has comments or questions, please speak up now. Otherwise, we'll turn our attention to the book of Vayikra, and we'll see something quite interesting.
No questions in chat, but again, if you do have questions, please do speak out. We want to hear your thoughts.
Okay, we can start with Vayikra, and then I think there'll be some questions on Vayikra. I have a lot of questions. So Vayikra is chapter 25. Chapter 25 of Vayikra, Parshat Bahar. Parshat Bahar is 1 chapter. Chapter 25, and that's where we have at some length the laws of the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and the laws of the Jubilee year. Okay, begins in chapter 25. Starts with the Shemitah, comes to the Jubilee year, all kinds of rules. We'll jump back as well. But let's start with verse 39. Chapter 25, verse 39. Torah says the following: V'chiyamuch achicha himach v'nimkar lach lo tavod bo avodat aved. Says the Torah. If you're literally, the word achicha literally is your brother. Here they translate your kinsman. If your brother, because it doesn't mean your actual brother, it means one of your kin. The word brother is often used, right, not as my actual brother, not the one that we have the same mother, but a relative, actually beyond relative, a Jew. Here the Torah calls it achicha, right? In Shemot we call it the Ivri. Here the Torah says achicha. What if your achicha becomes your much, becomes mach? Means becomes like the word namuch, means becomes poor. Here they translate continues in straits. V'nim karlach, and was sold to you. In other words, somebody is down and out, has no money, can't buy food. So what that person might do is sell himself as a slave. A person who became poor and sold himself as a slave. Lo tavod bo avodat ovid. Do not treat him, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. So let me just, before we get into this set of what I find a remarkable set of verses, actually. But actually, here it's interesting. Here's a question we did not raise last week when we talked about slavery. And that is, the Torah said in Shemot, chapter 21, if you buy a Hebrew slave, how does that work? How did you buy, under what conditions did you buy the Hebrew slave? So what's interesting is in the Talmud in this case is reflecting what the Torah says. The Talmud talks about two different ways that a person can become a slave. One is what we just read over here in Vayikra. You sell yourself as a slave. Why would somebody sell himself as a slave? Because he has no money, because he can't buy food. And if he becomes a slave, then the master is obligated to feed the slave. That's the assumption. That's why somebody might do it. However, in Sefer Shemot, in a verse we did not get to yet, but in Sefer Shemot, if we turn back for a moment to Sefer Shemot, chapter 22, verse number 1. This is an extremely interesting set of laws which we will study, but I just want to make one point over here. It's talking over here about someone who is robbing, a robber. And the Torah, this is a very important rule with all kinds of implications. A robber breaks into someone's house to steal. So the Torah, and the person inside the house kills the robber. What is the law? So that's the section over here. And the Torah says it depends when he comes, etc. In other words, what do we assume about this robber? Do we assume that the robber wants to steal something, but when confronted, he might even kill you? In which case, you are permitted to kill the robber. We'll discuss this in more detail when we get to it. However, if it says if the sun has risen, then you're not allowed to kill him. But rather, he has to pay for the thing he stole. In verse number 2, if the sun has risen, we'll discuss this another time. But damimlo, if you killed him, you're not allowed to kill him. He has blood, means you treat him like it's murder if you kill him. Shalem yishalem, the robber has to pay what he stole. V'im einlo, but if he has no money to pay, v'nimkar b'gneivato, he is sold for the slavery. In other words, here in this verse, the Torah says that if someone robbed and has no money to pay back, then the court, presumably, would sell him as a slave, so that the work that he does for the work that he does for his labor, that money can then be, or the person who purchases the slave, that money would go to the one who was robbed. This is the only case in the Torah that talks about forcing somebody to be a slave. It's the robber who doesn't have money to pay back. Elsewhere in the Bible, it's one of the Haftarot. We have the story of, if you recall, the story of the woman who went to Elisha, the prophet, and said that to Elisha the prophet, it's the word, the Shunammite woman. It's the Haftarah for the parsha of Vayera, the Akedah. But the Haftarah begins with the following story, just to refresh our memories. That is, a woman went to Elisha and said, my husband died. He was a God-fearing man, and you know that. And we have no money, and we owe money. And the creditor is going to take my 2 children as slaves. It's the 4th chapter of 2 Kings, Melachim Bet. And there you see, by the way, that woman says, but my husband owed money. It's a good man, righteous man, right? You know that. But we have debts. And someone's going to take my children as slaves. It's not even taking the guy who incurred the debt as a slave. He's going to take my children as slaves. So what you see from that is that apparently was assumed. If you can't pay your debts, they take you as a slave. In the case of Elisha, in that story, they take my kids as slaves. But the Torah doesn't have that. The Torah limits it, or we only find it in the Torah in the case of a thief. So that's what we don't know in the beginning of Mishpatim, which says if you buy a Hebrew slave, was this mandated by the court? Or is this somebody who just sold himself as a slave? The Torah doesn't say. Because the rabbinic, the Talmud tries to work it all out. This parsha is talking about when the court sells. The parsha in Vayikra is talking about when he sold himself because he was poor. I'm simply pointing out that in Mishpatim, it doesn't say why he sold himself, but here it says it. Someone is poor, can't make a living, can't feed himself or his family, so he sells himself as a slave. What does the Torah say? In that case, the Torah says, "Lo tavod bo avodat avid." Do not treat him as a slave, but rather, in the next verse, "Kisachir ketoshav ye'imach, ad shnat hayovel ya'avod imach." Says the Torah. This Hebrew man who sold himself as a slave because he can't make ends meet, he's not a slave. You don't treat him as a slave. You treat him as a worker. Kisachir ketoshav. Now, exactly the difference between Sochir and Toshav, so the various commentaries try to figure that out. Sochir could be someone who just works for you, and you pay him by the hour, whatever it is. Toshav, the Ramban thinks, is someone who is living in your house, for example, and he's helping out around the house. For example, the story of Yaakov in the house of Lavan. When Yaakov runs away to Lavan, Lavan says to him, "Because you're my brother, you should work for nothing? Tell me what your wages are." So he's in the house already, he's living with him, and he's working in there as opposed to an outside worker. But in either event, whether it's a worker who lives there or an outside worker, that person gets a wage. He's not a slave. In other words, what the Torah seems to be saying is, when it comes in the book of Vayikra, when it comes to slavery of a Hebrew slave, now the Torah only speaks about someone who was forced to sell himself because he's poor. That is to say, maybe this is different than if the court sells you. Maybe then you are a slave. That's how the Gemara tries to work it out. But the Torah just says over here, it gives the reason. Why would somebody be a slave? Who would ever want to be a slave? Has no choice. Don't treat him as a slave. And then it says something else. Ashnat hayovel yavod himach. He works for you until the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year is every 50 years. So he works for you until the 50th year. In other words, over here, when we're just reading what the Torah says, no rabbinic understandings over here, just what the Chumash says. The Chumash says he doesn't go in after 6 years. He works until the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year, everybody goes free, whether you want to or not. He goes free. The Torah here doesn't give the option to stay on longer, by the way. The Torah doesn't say he's a slave forever. Because he's not a slave, actually. He's not a slave at all. He's a worker. You treat him as a worker. In the Jubilee year, he leaves. Hu ubanav imo. V'shavo mishpachto v'yo achuzat avotav yashuv. Says the Torah further. Again, I'm not working with the rabbinic understandings, how they try to work it all out. I'm not dealing with that. That's an interesting question. I'm dealing with just what it says in the Chumash. That in the 50, he leaves, he takes with him his children. In other words, this idea of that you can give him a woman, a slave woman, and that the kids belong to the master, is something in the book of Vayikra, it doesn't mention that at all. If you have only Vayikra, you would never imagine such a thing. He's not even really, we wouldn't even call him a slave. We eliminate slavery. There's no slavery. So when Jubilee year comes, the contract is over, and he takes the kids with him. Torah doesn't distinguish how did he have these kids from a slave woman, from his own wife, doesn't mention the wife altogether. He returns home. he goes home to the Achuzat Avotav, to the possession, the family possession. And now the Torah gives the reason. Ki avodayim asher otzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim lo yimachru mimkeret eved. Says the Torah, says God, these are my slaves who I took out of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. Lo yimachru mimkeret eved, by the way, can be understood two different ways. One is that you should not sell them as a slave. It's a prohibition. Lo yimachru mimkeret eved. That's one possibility. Then there's another possibility, which is not that you shouldn't do it, you can't do it. It's not possible. You can't make them your slaves because I already have, because they're my slaves, right? As Rashi commented, my contract came first. So when it comes to the Hebrew slave, God took us out of Egypt for the purpose of, says the Torah, being God's servants. That's our obligation, to be God's servants. If you're God's servant, you can't be anybody else's servant. So the Torah gives this reason. Now, when you read the book of Exodus, when you read Sefer Shemot, there's nothing even like that at all, right? You can't. The Torah here simply has eliminated slavery. Then the Torah adds something else. Lo tirdebo b'forech v'yoreito melohecha. You shall not treat them b'forech. Now, the word b'forech should be familiar to all of us because it appears in the very beginning of Sefer Shemot. And b'forech means that we translate it as crushing labor. It's what Pharaoh did. It's what Pharaoh did to the Jews, right? Vayavidu Mitzrayim et bnei Yisrael b'forech. Interesting is something else over here that Rashi comments on the word perech. The word perech will appear again later. We'll see it in a couple of minutes. Rashi comments, b'ferech, says Rashi, don't give them labor. Don't be ma'aneh them. Exactly the words of the beginning of the book of Shemot, under the pretense of work. What Rashi is picking up is that's exactly what Paro did. Paro pretended that he wants them to work, but the real purpose was not to make them work, was to make them suffer. So Rashi says it is forbidden under the clear that these are my slaves. So these are working for me. It's tough. Work is tough. No, says the Torah. You cannot do that. Right? Now here the Torah adds something which we don't have in the book of Exodus. If you want to purchase slaves, says the Torah, you may purchase slaves, but not from your own people, but from the nations that surround you. It's permitted to purchase from them slaves. Not only that, the Torah says, and even from those that reside with you, non-Jews, who live with you, they were born in your land. You can purchase slaves from the non-Jewish residents who live with you. You may purchase them, and they belong to you, and they're really your slaves, and they're slaves forever. And your children can inherit them. You can work with them forever. You can enslave them. But you may not impose harsh labor upon your fellow Jew. Now, the truth of the matter is that this entire passage, in other words, when we read the book of Shemot, the Torah never discussed non-Jewish slaves. Never. It only discussed in book of Shemot Jewish slaves. The non-Jewish slaves are mentioned over here in contrast, because what the Torah is saying over here is slavery for the Jews is out of the question. And I'll tell you why. because slavery does exist for the Jews, but the avdus for the Jews is being God's slave. Since I took you out of Egypt, whoever I took out of Egypt to be my avadim, it can't be anybody else's avadim. But the other nations are not. I didn't take them out. I didn't free them. I didn't make them my servants. So they can be other people's servants. But for you, slavery is out of the question. That's what the Torah says. Then the Torah continues. I just wanted to fill out this discussion of slavery in the book of Vayikra, which is, again, the Torah does not eliminate slavery. Non-Jews can have slavery. Jews can purchase the non-Jew as a slave. But when it comes to Bnei Yisrael, there is no slavery. In the book of Vayikra, there's simply no slavery. A slave is not treated as a slave. A slave is a worker. Yes, some people are hard-pressed, and they may sell themselves. And by the way, this is a very important point in general, which is raised by the commentaries on the Talmud. And if we have time today, I'll get to this as well. And that is that the question that is raised by the commentaries on the Talmud, which is a very relevant question to us. We distinguish between slavery and the work. The question that the commentaries on the Talmud raises, what exactly is the difference between slavery and work? Most people in this planet that work are not doing so because they have some calling, some great purpose, Most people on this planet work because if they don't work, they have no food at night to eat. That's why most people work. And people take on all kinds of jobs, many of which are quite awful, just because what choice do they have? It's easy to forget that in certain societies where people have fancy jobs and what is their life calling and all that, which is a good thing, not fancy, but life calling. But many people, that's not an option. And the commentaries on the Talmud and even the Shulchan Aruch discuss under what conditions work becomes slavery. I think it's a very important question. But we have this distinction that is drawn in the Torah here between the worker and the slave. I just want to finish up these other sections in Vayikra to get a fuller picture of what's being said over here. In the next section, beginning in verse number 47, I'll stop and take comments and questions in a minute. Let's just look at this section and the third section of Vayikra to get a full picture of this. Now the Torah says, what about the following case? You're living in the land. There are Jews in the land, and there are also non-Jews in the land. There's a Geret and a Toshav. Someone lives with you. Rashi said they keep the 7 mitzvot of Bnei Noach, but they're not Jewish. But they're doing very nicely in the land. But Mach Achicha, but a fellow Jew, has become very poor. And v'nimkar leger toshav imach, and he was sold to one of the non-Jews. Oli eker mishpachat ger. Right, that's a very difficult term. Eker mishpachat ger. Here, the translation here is an offshoot of an alien family. The commentaries, the word eker, they think is actually a bit more negative than offshoot. It could be some kind of idolatrous family, those who are oker, who are uprooting the traditions, or whatever it is. It could be an offshoot. It could be, but in other words, the Jewish slave was forced to sell himself to non-Jews, resident non-Jews, or even beyond that, as understood by some of the commentaries, kind of idolatrous, an offshoot in the sense of some kind of family that is far removed from the Jewish values. Acharei nimkar geula tiyelo. After he was sold, he shall have redemption. Echad me echav yigolenu. Says the Torah, there is an obligation on his fellow Jews, his brothers, to actually buy him out, to redeem him. How are they going to redeem him? Ododo o ben dodo yigolenu. O misher b'saro mimishpachto yigolenu, or we seek your dove and nigal. It means someone's got to buy him out. Maybe an uncle, maybe a cousin. Maybe if he found some money, he can buy himself out. But there's an obligation on the community, on the Jewish community, to buy him out, to buy him out of slavery. It's kind of like we would call that pidyon shvuyim, to redeem the captive. But how do you redeem the captive over here? Now, this is not a captive by war. The person voluntarily sold himself. Nonetheless, he's in a bad place. It says that there's an obligation on the community to buy him out, which is called to redeem, ligol, geula. Says the Torah, v'chishavim konehu, mishnat himakro lo, ashnat hayovel, v'yo kesef mimkaro b'mispar shanim, kimei sochir yiyeimo. Imod rabot bashanim.
Rabbi Silber, excuse me, if they didn't know where to find Yosef, how would they find this family member? I mean, the communication is, they could be 1,000 miles away.
Right, but he's living in your land. He may be your next door neighbor.
But he may not.
That's right. If he's not, you can't do it. But the assumption is you do know where he is. He's a resident living with you, and he's not a Jew. He's someone who lives in your community. It's well known. And what's interesting over here is that actually, and you could see, so the person goes out in the Jubilee year, it says. In other words, the point is that the people who bought this Hebrew slave, if you say he goes out in the Jubilee year, it means that the non-Jew who bought him understands that in the Jubilee year, he's going to go out free. You're not talking to people who don't abide by the law. These are law-abiding non-Jews. Because in the Jubilee year, everybody goes free. So the people that purchase the Jewish slave accept that. But meanwhile, it's not the Jubilee year. Jubilee is one every 50 years. Maybe the Jubilee is in 20 years from now. So the Torah gives you a formula how to figure this out. You figure it out in the following way. You figure out how much was the slave, what is the slave, how much did the person pay for the slave? How much is the slave worth? How many years has the slave, when was the slave purchased? And how many years has the slave been a slave? So let's say the slave was purchased in the 30th year of the Jubilee. In 20 years, he's going to go free. And now it's the 40th year of the Jubilee. So the Torah says you then compute. There's 20 years till the Jubilee when he goes free. He's worked 10 years. He has 10 years left. So half the price is what has to be paid to the non-Jew. In other words, the Torah makes it very clear. You're talking about a situation where the Jews control the laws over here. Because in the Jubilee year, he's going to go out. Nonetheless, you have to, and this is a non-Jew, the Torah says you have to pay the non-Jew back the fair amount. You have to compute it out. The Torah says explicitly, you got to figure it out. And you compute it by the work. You compute the amount of work. And the Torah says in verse number 53, another remarkable statement, Kisachir shana b'shana yemo, lo yudene b'ferech li'enecha. Says the Torah, this Jew who is now a slave to the non-Jew, the non-Jew has to treat him like a worker. Now, what the non-Jew is going to do, we can't, hard to know. But lo yudene b'ferech li'enecha, he should not harshly treat him. In other words, li'enecha, in your sight. In other words, you have an obligation to make sure that the Jew who sold himself to the non-Jew is treated appropriately, is not treated like a slave. He is a slave, but he's purchased by the non-Jew, but there's an obligation that even purchased by the non-Jew, you have to make sure that he's not treated like a slave. And the Torah gives the reason again in the last verse of chapter 25. Kiwi b'nei Yisrael avodim, avodayhem, asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, ani Hashem Elohechem. These are my slaves. The Jews are my slaves, and therefore they can't be anybody else's slave. So here's this obligation on the community to actually redeem this person who sold himself to the non-Jew. Now, I just wanted to point out one other thing before I take any comments or questions. that if we look at the previous set of verses, that is to say, verse number 35, you get a fuller picture of what's going on in chapter 25 of Vayikra, and how remarkable it actually is. Because the Torah in verse number 35 of this chapter says the following: V'chiyamuch achicha umata yado imach. If your brother became poor, your brother was poor. Verse 35. Your brother became poor. His hand is he comes under, right? Umata yado imach. He is mata is like slipping. He said he becomes weak. V'chezakta bo. You should strengthen him. Ger v'toshav v'chai imach. It's, in other words, what it sounds like, actually, it's not 100% clear. In other words, the point is someone is poor, someone is slipping, someone's getting into a bad situation, and it sounds like, it says your brother, and then it's at the end of the verse, it says, Ger v'toshav v'chai imach. Someone who is a resident alien, right? Let him, right? V'chai imach. Let him live by your side. Strengthen him. In other words, there's an obligation on the community. Someone is getting into a bad place. There's an obligation to actually strengthen the person. And that plays out. The Torah says, strengthen the person. Al tikach meito neshech mitarbit v'yoreito meohecha v'cheyochicho imach. Don't take interest from the person. The person's in bad shape. The person needs money. Says the Torah, the Talmudic understanding is that this rule applies not just to Jews. This applies to Ger and Toshav Imach. It applies equally or also to non-Jewish residents who live with you. There's an obligation to make sure that people don't get into the situation in the first place. That is to say, the obligation is not just that there's no slavery, but there's the obligation here to make sure that people are in a situation where they're forced to sell themselves as slaves. The Ramban counted this as one of the 613 commandments. And the Torah then again gives a reason in verse number 38. Ani Hashem Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I don't want someone to not have a full stake in the land. I don't want someone to not be able to function. It gives a reason again. And by the way, the chapter 25 gives the first part of chapter 25, which deals with the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year, everything goes back to the way it was. You start over again. To start over. All the lands return to the previous owners. All the slaves go free, as we saw. You bought someone in the 48th year, 8th year of the Jubilee. 2 years later, the person goes free. Totally goes free. And the Torah gives a reason. The Torah explains. The Torah says, what's this about? That in the Jubilee year, everything goes free. All the lands, I bought a piece of land, and 2 years later, I got to return it. Why? Well, why is that? Says the Torah. I'll tell you why, says the Chumash. The Chumash says that the land cannot be sold forever, in perpetuity. You can't sell the land. You know why you can't sell the land? Because it's not your land. It's not yours. Let's find that verse. It's not your land. It's my land, says God. Where's that verse? Where is that verse? It is here someplace or other. 1 second. Here it is. Verse number 23. Chapter 25, verse 23. And with this, I'll stop and take any comments or questions.
Which book? 25, 23?
Same chapter. Chapter 25 of Vayikra. Verse 23. It's all in Vayikra, chapter 25. We should spend more time on this. The land may not be sold forever. Again, the question, may not be or cannot be. You can't sell the land forever. Why not? Because because the land is my land, says God. This land belongs to me. You are simply residents with me. It's very striking that the Torah calls God's speaking to the Jewish people here. As far as I'm concerned, you are Gerim and Toshavim. Remember, the word Ger Toshav later on seem to refer to the non-Jews who live there. But over here, Gerim v'Toshavim atem imodi. Why does the land return in the 50? I bought the land. Why do I have to give it back? Because it was never the person's land in the first place. It's all mine, says God. You happen to live in the land. And if you don't understand that, in other words, the land in chapter 25, what's interesting is it is about your land. The land is ours as long as we understand that the land is not ours. That's how it works. And you see that in this entire chapter, the land is mine, and the people are mine. People are my servants, and the land is my land. That's chapter 20. And therefore, you can't really be a slave to another human being. You really don't own anything fully, because it's my place, it's my land, and it's my slaves. I took them out of Egypt for the purpose of being my slaves. Now the other people, they're not my slaves. So the slavery does exist as far as they are concerned. But it's only mentioned here of the non-Jewish slave in contrast to the Jewish slave. The focus is not on the non-Jewish slave. The focus is the Jews not being slaves. They can't be slaves. And since they can't be slaves, this is a moral point. Therefore, you have to make sure that nobody is even in the situation where they might be a slave. That's the mitzvah of the hechazak lebo. Don't wait till they're in such a desperate situation where they're going to sell themselves as slaves. Avoid that. Support them before you get to the critical point. That's the idea of tzedakah, actually. The idea of the highest level of charity, the Rambam says, is give someone a loan. Is to enable them that they don't need charity. That's what it says in chapter 25. Now, my point is, before I stop now and take any comments or questions, this is completely different than what we read in chapter 21 of Sefer Shemot. All of this is completely different. It's like one has nothing to do with the other. It's a radically different text here. We say, well, Karav Zelzeh. It's a radically different text. And this is actually a radical idea. This is the elimination, at least as far as the Jews are concerned. There is no slavery. Every slave is just a worker. And slavery is a bad thing, and you have to stop it. You have to prevent it. And if someone was a slave, then redemption. You have to redeem the slave. I'll stop at this point for this. We have another text, of course. But if there are any comments or questions, I'll be happy to again, remember, we focus on what the text says. We haven't focused on a whole other world, which is when the rabbis are discussing these two different texts, they want to somehow, in creating a system, a set of laws, they want to figure out how these two texts work together. Because when you read the two texts, they are night and day, actually. How does one, there's no mention here whatsoever, by the way, about any distinction of male or female slaves. It doesn't mention female slaves at all. It says nothing about marriage. Maybe there is no female slavery altogether because there's no slavery here. It's just work. Or maybe there's no distinction. The Torah doesn't say. In the third text, the Torah will talk about that. This text doesn't mention the female slaves. It talks about the elimination of slavery. Okay, are there any comments or questions here?
So far, nothing in chat, but people are welcome to speak up and unmute themselves.
Is there a issue of the context of when it was said, when it was written? Mishpatim is immediately after Yetziat Mitzrayim, where they were still in the mindset of themselves being slaves, and it takes time in the Midbar to begin to have the concept of being slaves to God, as opposed to that early stage where they still think of themselves as slaves.
I think that's an excellent point, actually. I totally agree with that. I think that's an excellent point. That when we first leave Egypt, as you say, psychologically, we understand slavery very well. we probably even assume that it's somehow even a given. In other words, it's only later on as we start to walk through the desert that we have this new idea. And then basically that slavery is not a given at all. That for us, we've now become God's. And I would add to what you're saying, which I think is a very profound point, actually, that we're still in the book of Exodus. In other words, we haven't gotten yet to building the Mishkan, where it becomes clear that you build a Mishkan, you work for God. The avoda you're doing is building God's space, God's temple, God's holy space. And then that further will change the whole nature of work altogether. It's a different kind of work. You don't work for the human. When you're God's Eved, it's different than being the human Eved. But your point is, as there's a kind of progression over here, I think I like that point very much. I think it's also important that we get to the third text in Sefer Dvarim, that we'll see there's a third text about slavery, which is very different than the first two. Well, maybe it's related to the first two. We'll have to figure that out. But the idea that there's a kind of progression, to me, makes a lot of sense in terms of resolving the obvious difference between these two texts. Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you for that point. Anybody else?
I was just thinking about what Chaim said, and that here in Shmot, they're seeing themselves, and it's in first person. And when it gets to Vayikra, they can distance themselves and they can see a little that there is the other. They can identify as Bnei Yisrael, and then there's different. And in Devarim, as you said, then there is the thought about a slave running away. That's already like a different level that they can differentiate of different possibilities within slavery, and where it might not be good. That's far from where they were already at Har Sinai.
Right. I wasn't referring to the. I'll get back to your first point about who's being addressed when we get to the Devarim, but I wasn't referring to the pasuk about the runaway slave. That's an interesting point about the runaway slave. I was referring to where the Torah actually talks about slavery. There's a section in chapter 15 that actually deals with slavery. We'll see that, and then we come up with something completely new, and a new thing that we never heard of before, which will come up. Let's take a look at that now. We still have a good 15 minutes, so let's take a look in Dvarim. First, chapter 15, verse number 12, I think it is, verse 12. A short section over here, not that short actually. Let's take a look. We'll start it now, but we'll finish it. So here the Torah says, if one of your brothers, right, a brother, a Hebrew slave, or a Hebrew or a woman who's a woman, right, a Hebrew woman, an Ivriya, if they're sold to you, thou shalt work for 6 years. Remember that the 6 years in Vayikra didn't exist altogether. There was no 6 years in Vayikra. You worked till the Jubilee. Torah didn't mention 6 years over there. Now, and right here it talks about Vavodcha, right? They shall be your slave. They shall work for you, an Eved, for 6 years. Uvashana hashviit tishalchenu chavshi meimach. In the 7th year, after 6 years, in the 7th year, you shall send them out. The Torah is addressing the buyer over here, you who bought the slave. Notice over here, there's no difference between the male and the female slave. In Shemot, there was a whole distinction. The female slave is actually not really a slave. She becomes a wife. The Hebrew slave is a slave who works for 6 years, right? But not over here. In Sefer Dvarim, which is always different, there's no difference. Male slave, female slave, 6 years. In the 7th year, they go free. Fine. Now, when you send them out, when you free them in the 7th year, Lo tishalchenu reikam. Do not send them away with nothing. Reikam. In other words, here we have a new concept that when you free the slave after 6 years, because in Sefer Shemot it said it goes out free. There's no sense in Shemot that we studied Sefer Shemot. There's no sense that after 6 years you have to give him anything. He goes out 6 years. But here, no. Here at the end of 6 years, it sounds like, you can't send them away with nothing. Rekam. Rather, ha'anek ta'aniklo, mitzonecho, migoncho, miikvecha, asher berachecha, Hashem Elohecha, titein lo. You must give him hanek ta'aniklo, furnish him. It's a word that doesn't appear too many places. Furnish him, right? Hanek tanik, and anak actually I think is a bracelet or a necklace, some kind of jewelry. In other words, give him something, or it could be her as well. Give them some of your flock, your flock, your threshing floor, the vat. Give them something substantial when they leave from that which God has blessed you. Why? The Torah doesn't give the rationale, but look at the next verse. Remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Here the Torah explicitly connects slavery to the experience of being slaves in the land of Egypt. In Sefer Shemot, it wasn't explicit. It's implicit, but it's not explicit. Here it is explicit. And remember, when we left Egypt, remember what God said to Moshe in the beginning. God told Moshe, they'll leave with many possessions. And God instructs Moshe to tell the people, God tells Moshe instructs him that the Jews should ask their Egyptian masters for gifts, for gold and silver and clothing, etc. Now, what that is about is the question. It sounds like the Chumash is saying over here, the same way when you left Egypt, when they freed you from Mitzrayim, they gave you these gifts. So too, you should act the same way towards those that you have, that were your slaves. And when they leave you, the same way I instructed the Egyptians to give the Hebrews the gold and the silver, you also have to do it from that which God has blessed you. And remember, says the Torah, that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Whether that is simply like severance pay or a sign of appreciation for what you've done, whether it's payment of back wages because you didn't get paid and you should have gotten paid, or whether it's all about the ability to, or making the statement that, well, I would say in the case of Mitzrayim, it's a recognition that you are now a free person. I recognize you're free and you own your own property, because the slave doesn't own his or her own property. And in addition to that, it's also a way of saying, listen, if you send somebody out of your house free, but you don't have a penny in your pocket, so you're going to become a slave again. That's what the Torah said in Vayikra. When your brother becomes poor, sells himself as a slave. We don't want the person to be a slave. So therefore, we're going to give him enough resources that hopefully he won't become a slave, because he'll have the resources you will give him from that which God has blessed you. And here the Torah explicitly mentions the exodus from Egypt. And this is conspicuously absent from Sefer Shemot. This is something new in the book of Vayikra. Dvarim, rather. This is new in Sefer Dvarim. And the one who's being addressed over here is the master, is the owner. The owner is being addressed. And here, once again, the Exodus story has a moral component to it. Remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Fine. So this is completely new. We never saw this before. And now we have the following. What if the slave says, I don't want to leave? Now this we had in Sefer Shemot. The slave said in Sefer Shemot that he doesn't want to leave. right? He loves his master, he loves his wife, he loves his children, he doesn't want to leave. Over here, it doesn't put it in terms, right? It puts it in terms of why doesn't he want to leave? He loves you, he loves your house, for it's very good for him there. So what is the Torah saying implicitly? The Torah is saying implicitly, listen, now that I've told you about the responsibilities you have towards the slave, that you have to make sure this person never becomes a slave again. You have to give him from your blessing. You have to treat him properly. Given that that is the culture that I want to establish, why would anybody want to leave? He's gonna want to stay with you. He's gonna say, "I love you," and it doesn't mention the wife and kids. It mentions he loves you. In other words, you're going to establish such a culture that no one ever wants to leave. So the Torah says, if that be the case, and the same thing applies to the female slave as well. The Talmud has a different take on that, but the plain reading of the text is there is no difference. Then the Torah continues. It should not be harsh in your eyes that at the end of 6 years, you send them away with free. Not only free, they had free plus all the gifts. You might say to yourself, all of this, why? Why should I have to let the guy go after? Now let him go, or her go, but it gives them all these gifts and sustain them. For he has given you double service for the 6 years. I want to make 2 points over here, and then I'll stop for today's session, take any comments or questions. First point is, here the Torah speaks about slavery, right? Remember, you were a slave. The slave is a slave for 6 years, etc. But what is interesting is, in this last verse, it shouldn't be harsh in your eyes that you sent him free. He worked double what a worker works. Remember, in Vayikra, the Torah talked about the slave, kitoshav kisachir imach. And here the Torah also speaks of mishnes schar sachir. So the text in Devarim, I would say, connects both to the text, our text in Shemot, but it adds, it changes it because it adds this idea of Hanukkah, of giving the gifts when he leaves. It frames it explicitly in terms of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is appropriate for Sefer Shemot, but it's explicit over here. But it does also mention Mishnes Char Sochir Avodcha Sheish Shanim. He worked for you more than a normal worker works. Mishnes Char Sochir. Because a normal worker, why is he working more than a normal worker? Because the normal worker goes home, that's why. Because the worker has a job, 9 to 5 or whatever it is, and then works an hourly laborer, and goes home and has his own life. This Eved, he's always there. So the point is, in a sense, he's working much more than, right? He's working more. Mishneh could mean double, right? He's doing double time. And therefore, it shouldn't be harsh in your eyes. And God will bless you in all that you do. I wanted to add one other detail over here about this business of lo yiksheh b'einecha. There is another mitzvah, one mitzvah in particular, where the Torah says, we know it's difficult, but nonetheless, you have to keep the law. And it says it actually in this particular mitzvah. It's very striking. The mitzvah is a Shemitah, the sabbatical year. And what is very interesting is the following: the sabbatical year appears in 2 places in the Torah. It appears in chapter 25 of Vayikra. That's the chapter we focused on today. we focus on the last part of the chapter. But the chapter begins with the sabbatical year, the 7th year. During the 7th year, your land the land is free. The land is open to the public. And the Torah says, don't say it's too hard to keep the Shemitah. We know it's not easy because you can't work the field that year. You're not working the field, and your crops are hefker, and anybody can take it. Says the Torah, don't be concerned with that. In the ensuing years, or prior to that, you'll have double, you have much more. So I'm going to take care of you. Don't worry about it. That's what it says in Vayikra chapter 25. In this chapter, in Devarim chapter 15, we saw the last part of the chapter. But the chapter begins with Miked Sheva Shonim Taseh Shemitah. Every 7 years, there's the Shemitah. When you read what it says over here, in the beginning of chapter 15, it's not talking about the land. It's talking about something completely different. It's called Shmitat Ksafim. Debts are canceled at the end of the 7th year. Debts are canceled at the end of the 7th year. And the Torah says, don't say, I'm not going to lend money because the Shemitah is coming, because the debt is canceled at the end of the 7th year. How can I lend money? I'm going to lose my money. Don't say that. Don't say that. God is going to bless you. So the law of Shemitah, which appears in proximity to the law of slavery, both in Vayikra 25 and in Devarim chapter 15, in the law of Shemitah is where the Torah says, we know it's difficult, nonetheless, God will bless you. And the Torah says the same thing over here in terms of slavery, the freeing of the slave. You free the slave, give the slave gifts, and the Torah says it shouldn't be difficult. You say, how can this is too much, right? Don't begrudge the slave. The slave has worked very hard. Don't begrudge the slave, and I will bless you in all that you do. So here we have 3 different places in the Torah where the Torah speaks of slavery. Beginning of chapter 21 of Shemot, the end of chapter 25 of Vayikra, and chapter 15 in the book of Devarim, and the 3 are very different. I wanted to make one last point about, well, maybe I'll stop here and make the point about Sefer Devarim when we continue next week. So next week we will, I wanted to finish up another thought about slavery, about specifically Sefer Devarim, what I think is different about Sefer Devarim when it comes to slavery. And then we'll move to the next section, which I think will be what I mentioned before. I like to focus on the law of the so-called machteret, the robber who comes in at night to rob, and the right that the person has to prevent the robber from doing that, even if you kill the robber.
Rabbi
That's a very,
Silber?
very, excuse me?
No, I was going to ask you something.
Go ahead
No.
and ask.
I was going to ask you, why are we not ending with that you have to get him out because he's a human being? Why are we ending here? Not we, but the pasuk is saying, but if he really wants to stay, why do you have to have that responsibility? If it's Hashem who is sort of, uber alles, so to speak. Why is he coming back, and why you have to be, empathetic to him?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, it comes up here, and it comes up also in Sefer Shemot, where the person can say, I want to stay on. Well, the Torah, as I said, the Torah discourages it. You have this ritual of piercing the ear. So obviously the Torah doesn't like it. But it raises a bigger question about law in general, and especially in the book of Devarim, it comes up, laws deal with reality. And the Torah, the commentary especially on Sefer Devarim, there are all kinds of laws, and we can talk about that, which are what the Gemara says, Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara. The Torah deals with reality, and the reality is that for some people, they find it very, very difficult to set out and to be free. Freedom for a lot of people is very difficult. So the Torah does allow for it, but it discourages it. And it's not limited to the case of the slave who wants to stay on. There are more striking examples, but the Gemara speaks of, well, Dibra Torah El Keneged Yetzer Hara. we'll be studying Sefer Devarim. We deal with that in some depth. I will come back to Sefer Devarim in the beginning of the next session, and then we will move to another section of Sefer Shemot, of the laws of Mishpatim. All right, so I'll stop at this point. Thank you again, and look forward to the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank
And
you.
I'd like to remind people that more Spheres Mon classes are starting this week, including with Dr. Sam Levins and Rabbi Dan Margulies. If you check out our website at dresha.org/classes, you can sign up and find out more. Take care
Thank you.
and be well.
Thank you both. Toda Rabah.